So the piece here is called The Ghost of Grainger, and it deals with the building itself based on 3D scans with a LiDAR scanner. We created a 3D model of the building and then used that to create an artistic work. So the story of the piece is first introducing the building and its context as a physical context, then going into an interior and having a trajectory through the building to explore the geometry and the specific layout, and then coming to an end where the building dissolves and becomes a totally abstract composition. The reference there is that the building has a problematic history in a way, from my point of view, but also stands for very much experimental arts and creative practice. And the piece highlights both of them, so the problematic with the history and the building haunted by its founder in a way, but at the same time rising out of the ashes and becoming something else than it originally was planned for. So nowadays, and these pieces are part of that, it is a kind of a creative laboratory for artistic experimentation, and that's a great change. The Grainger allows for this kind of transition. From an architectural design research point of view, it's very much about architectural representation. So architects represent either in planar, two-dimensional representations or in 3D models or physical models, but it's always focused on the object. What I investigate is how a representation could add another layer to that pure physical, that in a way a building is not just its brick and mortar, it's its history, its past, its present and its future, and the animations and the image manipulation talk about that, and it becomes from a very abstract, distant experience looking at sections and elevations to something which is now in the background, which becomes very emotional and kind of almost upsetting through the sound and the collaboration with composer Sydney Miller.
So when I started making the sound for this museum, I there's a lot of distinct areas and kind of rooms and compartments throughout this space, so I really wanted to reflect each individual space uniquely and create a specific soundtrack for each area. So the first room that's connected to the foyer, and symmetrically they're identical, so the sound is the same on each side except reflected. The first room I felt like it was very linear and lots of wooden textures. When I went in there to record, it was very bright because typically the blinds are up. I recorded all of those sounds. I brought in materials of wooden spoons and furniture, and so I recorded some sounds of that. And then I really wanted to reflect my experience in this space, not as somebody that's, familiar with the technicalities of architecture, but somebody who is familiar with the way that sound works and is more of an audience member walking through this space. So I wanted to reflect an experience that I thought anybody would really be familiar with when they walked through. When I walked through that first one, I was like, lots of straight lines, very reverberant, the bouncing of sound. So I really wanted to create a soundtrack and manipulate those initial wooden sounds to reflect that. When I went into this second room through here, I noticed that it was very, very curved and much more cement-like and metallic. So I brought a lot of different materials in that were kind of, jewellery that I brought through. I brought some different kinds of shoes and walked them through the space as well. And so I used a lot of different manipulative audio techniques in this space to kind of emulate this feeling of moving around in a curved dimension. As you're walking through here, it kind of feels like the sound is staying the same but moving with the curvature of this space. And then when I came through to this last room, the metallic and cement-like feeling kind of continues from the last room, but it's much more linear and it feels like you're kind of coming to a finish. So I really wanted to kind of make this really dramatic and intense track to make it feel like you had to go through that way to leave, and make it kind of very clear the direction of which you should be travelling. The other thing that was really important for me was making sure that each of the soundtracks interacted with each other. So they all have, they're all on a 2-minute loop. but I also manipulated them so that there's different pockets in each of the tracks and the rooms at different times that encourage you to visit different areas. There'll be a silence in one area, there'll be something else playing in another area, and it'll kind of encourage you to move around the space and experience the sound from different standing points in the museum. But everywhere that you stand, it kind of feels and sounds different. So there's a lot to explore, even though there's only 2 minutes of music in each section of the building, except for the foyer where it's 6 minutes. So I kind of wanted to create something that was playing with the dryness of the courtyard in terms of sound, because for the rest of the museum it's very reverberant, and I had to kind of manipulate the sound that I was making to suit that kind of environment. So when I came out here, I really wanted to play with that dryness, but then also kind of create like a more interactive sonic space out here, because there's so many different points in this kind of confined area with isolated speakers. So I wanted to play with panning and, you know, have some sounds coming out in different ones at different times, trying to make this space feel reverberant in some way, and kind of creating an artificial reverberance that feels a little bit like what you experience inside, except it's much more natural when it's inside.
Well, the way we started talking about the work was no one of us had anything finished. It was in a very early stage, so I think that was really interesting.
Yeah.
That we were kind of together exploring what it might become.
I think we both also had that kind of initial concept about kind of addressing the physicality of the building and still kind of contemplating the, you know, the problematic nature of Grainger in the beginning. So that was easy to kind of inform the collaboration as we went as well.
Yeah, we came from a similar, you know, point of view in relationship to it. But you had longer relationships with the building and the museum, because you've worked before also.
Yeah, so I have done a few things in the past when I've been, when I was a student doing my bachelor's degree in interactive composition. So I have done a few pieces here in the past. So I was pretty, you know, familiar with a lot of the history behind the museum, but I'd never been able to respond so, you know, distantly to his, you know, legacy in a way, I guess. I think it was, you know, really interesting to interact with the museum itself rather than, you know, the contents that used to fill it. So, yeah, it was really interesting to be able to have an empty shell to work with and then go from there.
Well, I never seen it actually full. So when I came in the first time, it was already half empty.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the person. I couldn't even pronounce the name. It was like, who, when, what? So I've totally been a stranger. But then we started 3D scanning, spending a lot of time here, looking at the models, going to the archive, looking at the pieces. And I really like kind of the creative part of his work with the musical instruments, like as an object and machines, and kind of pre-empathizing the synthesizer with this idea of free music. So I guess that's also, you know, your entry point possibly as a composer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the experimental nature of the work that he used to do definitely was an influence for both of our works, sonically and visually, for the Sounding Grainger and the Ghost of Grainger.
Yeah.
In terms of the visuals and the way that we linked it up, it was kind of also a bit of playing as we went as well, right? So we started, you know...
Well, we had like the first, so the 3 acts, we had the first 2 acts sort of visually ready as a draft.
Yeah.
And then we shared that with Sydney. And then Sydney composed for the first, along the images for the first 4 minutes, and then composed without the images for the last 2 minutes, but based on the story that basically it becomes very abstract. That's why I think we only said, oh, it's going to be very abstract, and it could be a firework, and it should come to a sudden end.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this idea with the phoenix rising out of the ashes, and then it's like end, and then something new starts. And the visual is also then based on that it doesn't start and stop somewhere, that it keeps going. So it's this ongoing loop. And that was the kind of, I think the biggest challenge for us, how we make it visually, that it loops also with the sound. But it was great working with the sound, and that's not the right image now, but we use the sound, its volume and rhythm to animate the model. So it's an algorithm, so the software responds to your sound, while for the first part you responded to the visuals. And I thought that was a really nice moment of having everyone's integrity and kind of autonomy, but then having a handover and trusting that the other one's going to do something well with it. So that was a really good, I think, in a way, not so precious collaboration.
Yeah.
No one was going, oh God, you can't do this to my piece, or you can't do that to my piece, or something.
I think it kind of highlighted the true nature of a collaboration where there was no direction or clear brief from either of us. It was kind of piece by piece and then fitting it together alongside, you know, putting both of the aesthetics of the general direction of both works and then kind of threading them together to create this kind of final work.
Yeah. And a trust, I think, like, you know, a mutual trust that, you know, the work will be great to whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
I played the sound to other people, they had some problems with it, and we're going, no, it's her work, you know, it's your work. I'm fine with it. And for us it was also because we always looked at the images. As soon as we had the sound, it was like, whoa, it's a whole nother layer.
Yeah,
like,
it's very different.
Because it's different than, you know, I don't like sounds normally. I just take side recordings. I don't underlay things with someone's, you know, other music or pop music or whatever. So it's like, because the sound was made for the piece, I think it became much stronger and much more effective and effective. So, like, you know, the impact when you watch it, like, that's the thing now. Where this part was when the visual responds to the sound clearly and is informed through an algorithm, so we're not actually controlling it that much. So every time you play that on the computer, it's now recorded, but every time you play it, it looks different. Yeah. Because the algorithm then takes other elements again.
Yeah. I think that also the way that I structured my sound for the whole building, I was recording different parts of each section of the building to kind of represent how, as a composer and an audience member walking through, I felt that each part of the building made me feel. So I felt it was really important for me to kind of use those kind of recordings and then manipulate those to reflect you know, the irregularity of the visuals and the narrative of that going. So that's why, you know, it starts very dry with those sounds of a foyer, and then, you know, I manipulate them over time to disrupt them similarly to the way that the visuals have been disrupted as well with the Grainger.
What I think is also interesting is that in the second part in the video, when there are 3 cameras, that tries to talk about the symmetry of the building. So that, you know, you go out in the courtyard and you go down the corridor and it looks like it's mirrored, but it's not, because it's symmetrical. And then when you go through, you see that there are different aspects in the building. So you have to compare 2 images which look very much the same but are slightly different. And you do the same with the sound. You talk about the kind of how it's mirrored. So, you know, left and right is the same sound. That space, diagonal left and right, is the same sound. So it's also talking with the sound about that symmetry.
Yeah, exactly. And also the other thing about that is that whilst the sound is identical and just reflected on both sides, even as you're walking through, it still sounds slightly different in each side, similarly to the visuals of the mapping of it as well for each side, which I think is cool.
Well, thanks for the collaboration.
Yeah, you too.